other groups like this. And what are the lessons we can learn from the PIRAHA? Well, for one thing, the PIRAHA are happy without God. And that violates a lot of the predictions, not only of religious folks, but of anthropologists, who believe that God is an essential ingredient of all culture. That's false. There are cultures that get by just fine without any concept of God. The PIRAHA have very little coercion in their culture. You don't tell other people what to do. One adult doesn't tell another adult what to do. There are expectations, and when they're violated, they can be remedied in different ways. So, for example, most PIRAHA are promiscuous during the full moon when they're walking around in circles, or you can call it dancing, but it's basically walking around in circles, singing and having a good time. And so there was this. I went to get this fellow to work with me on the language one day, and I walked up to his hut, and I didn't really pay much attention to the configuration there, but I said, "Can you work with me?" And his head was in his wife's lap, and he started to raise his head, and she had him by the hair and put it down and whacked him on the head with a stick. And he grinned and he said, "I can't go today. I have to stay here." And I said, "Why not?" He says, "Oh, I don't know." I left and I asked another guy, "How come his wife hit him in the head?" He says, "Oh, well, because he was out with some other woman last night, so he's got to sit there today and he can't move." And that was the end of it. That's the punishment. There's no form of marriage. There's no form of divorce except that if you want to get married with someone, you go away with them for a couple of days. When you come back, you're married. And if you were married before that, that's also the divorce. And that's the end of it. There's no more to do. There's nobody to pay, nothing to say. And people who were crying and screaming and wailing because their spouse ran off with another spouse a few days before are done with it when they get back. And they have very interesting ways of dealing with their problems and dealing with the issues around them. They're individualists. Everyone is pretty much responsible for themselves. But if you can't take care of yourself, then they will take care of you. Children are pretty much autonomous from the time they're 9 or 10. A boy knows how to fish very well when he's 9 or 10. He doesn't need his father to feed him. He'll do what his father says if he feels like it, which most of the time he does because his father can get more fish than he can. And his father will share with him if he gets fish. But they are raised by the village. If the parents go off, they might take their children or they might leave them there, but everyone takes care of them. So it's a very interesting combination of individuality and group responsibility. Are there other groups like this? I'm almost certain that there are. And I think that many of the descriptions that we have in the ethnographies that have been written by anthropologists over the centuries have been done by people who have their own biases. Whenever we go to a village, we have a bias. Whenever we go to do this kind of research, we have a bias, whether it's theoretical or culture or religious, and we have all of them. And so we find anthropologists who, like Malinowski, one of the fathers of modern anthropology, kept two sorts of journals. He kept one journal about the cultural observations he was making and another journal about his personal reaction. And he hated the people he was working with. He said terrible things about them in his journal. And he tried to keep them separate. He kept them separate in his journals, but I doubt if he kept them separate successfully in his mind. All of us, whether we're scientists or missionaries, take biases with us. But as William James said, to coin a phrase of his, it's the varieties of human experience, to paraphrase an expression of his, the varieties of human experience are very important to us. As I hear about studies and generalizations based on what religion does for us, like what we just heard about the professor at Harvard telling us how religion improves this, improves that. We need to look at a multitude of cultures, as many cultures as we can look at in our survey. Not just this one culture that comes from European culture that has over 2,000 years of Christianity affecting it tremendously and has given us this great concept that the PIRAHA show very, very rarely, if at all, which is called guilt. We live in guilt, and Christianity takes away our guilt. We have been made lost by religion in many respects, and finding salvation has become the task of so many Americans because they've been told that they're lost in one form or another. This guilt and the oppression of religion. as I began to think back on it and reflect at night of all the people I had met, it occurred to me that the most important lessons in my life were from meeting people who were not like me, whether they were Brazilian intellectuals or people from other religions, or people who had no religion, or people of other races and ethnicities. These were the lessons that had most affected me. So when the BBC asked me recently for this 60-second idea on how to change the world, I said, live a week with strangers. And I highly recommend living with strangers, whether it's, and by yourself. Take a week off. I hear now about this show called Wife Swap, where they do sort of live a week with strangers. But I have in mind even more profound difference. You know, find, if you feel, especially if you feel uncomfortable with the group, go try to work it out to stay a week there and just live with them. Learn from other people. And learn how different people come up with different solutions to the problems of the world. Many of the problems that face all of us are the same from culture to culture. They can vary if the culture plays a bigger role in setting the problem. But in terms of the biological problems that face us all, survival, happiness, food, clothing, shelter, these beset all of us. And how have different cultures solved them? In a big rainstorm in the Amazon, which is a pretty common occurrence, the pirahas, flimsy little houses, very often blow over at night, at 3 in the morning, and everybody's sopping wet. And what do you hear from them when this happens? Everybody's laughing. They think it's the funniest thing that ever happened. My house is over. And so what do? They move into somebody else's house. When we were there doing the film, they were all sleeping on the beaches, and it was dry season, but nevertheless a huge storm blew in one night, and there was no shelter because they had just come to see me, and they were all sleeping on the beaches. So I knew exactly what they were going to do, but I didn't say anything to anybody. They all came on the boat. 100 PIRAHA came on the boat, and it just scared everybody else, and but it was fun, and they can't understand, why would you mind missing a night's sleep, you know? Just sleep a little bit more tomorrow. What's the big deal?